Hello everybody, my name is Vuk Jeremić. I'm a professor of practice in international governance and diplomacy at the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po and editor-in-chief of Horizons, Journal of International Relations in Sustainable Development. We've been privileged to be host to many interesting speakers and to publish essays by multiple authors around the world over the past 10 years. And we like to think of ourselves as an open platform where East meets the West, where the North meets the South, where every opinion is welcome and equally legitimate. We have been talking about various parts of the world over the past years, and this particular issue of Horizons, the 32nd volume of Horizons, talks about the Asia-Pacific, the world's most vibrantly growing geography, increasingly significant in terms of geopolitics, but also geoeconomics, global trade, technology, etc. It gives me particular pleasure to welcome to Horizons discussion a very prominent analyst and expert of all things related to Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific, for that matter. That is Professor Gordon Flake. He is, as I said, one of the world's leading authorities on strategic developments in the area. Having spent 25 years in the US foreign policy community, focused on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia, and now 10 years in Australia's Indian Ocean capital of Perth. He is an expert by all means. He is currently leading the US Asia Center in Perth. He is also a prolific writer and a frequent commentator for leading global outlets, including the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and across the Australian media landscape. He is also a governor of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia, of AmCham, and he leads a number of important projects, academic projects and initiatives. It is an exceptional pleasure to welcome you to Belgrade, Professor Flake.
It is a great honor. It's my first visit, and already I've fallen in love with the place. What a beautiful city.
Thank you very much. It's very far away from the place where you currently live, so we appreciate the fact that you flew all the way to here and that we are having this conversation, which I'd like to start with the big picture. What I teach to my students in Paris is that the geopolitics is a cyclical affair, much like the economy. There are good periods followed by difficult periods. Of course, in the economics, the cycles are shorter and they're well quantified. Everybody knows when they start, when they end. In geopolitics, in my opinion, these cycles tend to be much longer. They don't last for years, they last for decades. And I believe that we are right now going through a recession period when it comes to geopolitics. And it was only 10 years ago, in 2015, that we were in a very good period. Somebody would even say that it was a peak in multilateral diplomacy with Paris Climate Treaty and Sustainable Development Goals and all that. So my question, Professor Flake, my first question is, do you believe that we are, as a world, in a geopolitical recession? And if your answer is yes, then why do you think we are in this recession?
Well, thank you. The answer is yes, and I love your framing. I hadn't conceptualized it that way, but the idea of a geopolitical recession makes a lot of sense. My own framing has been much more about eras or epochs, periods of time. And over the last year in particular, I have been evaluating the era in which we find ourselves now. And again, your framing of it as a recession is a useful way to think about it. The way I've defined it has been driven by my own personal experience. I'm a child of the Cold War, went through high school and most university during the Cold War. And at the end of the Cold War, I couldn't imagine a world after the Cold War era, right? So it was an end of an era. And I've told many of my friends this year that I feel like I'm in 1989 again. And by that I mean, we're speaking in November of 2025. In November of 1989, just last week, we would have seen the fall of the Berlin Wall. A development that was months in coming, with Hungary opening its borders to Austria and the flow beginning to move, that culminated in the events in November of 1989. But even at that point, even with the fall of the Berlin Wall, I was unable to imagine the next 35 years, what I think now in history we'll call a boom time in terms of geopolitics, sure. Right? The post-Cold War era. That's what we describe it as at this point. I couldn't conceptualize it. I had seen perestroika, I had seen glasnost, I'd seen the Reagan, Gorbachev summit in Reykjavik, but I couldn't imagine it. So in a similar way, in November of 2025, I feel like I'm in 1989 again, because one thing is clear is that the post-Cold War era is over. I'm not sure exactly when it ended. Was it Xi Jinping's first term or his unprecedented third term? Was it Putin's invasion of Crimea in 2014 or the full-scale invasion of Ukraine? Was it Donald Trump's first term or Donald Trump's re-election? One way or the other, somewhere in the last 4 or 5 years, the post-Cold War era ended. It's over. But I don't know what the next era looks like. So I like your framing. Yes, we're in a recession. The reasons we're in that recession, the reasons why it's over, is because of decisions of individuals and decisions of nation states. So obviously the high point that you rightly described about a decade ago, if you ask the question, why are we not there now? Part of them are broad geopolitical trends. Part of them are, the difficulty of maintaining democratic societies with information flows. But there are decisions made in China, there are decisions made in Moscow, and there are decisions made in Washington, D.C. that have fundamentally altered that world. And so that's the world we're in. And I have a hard time looking ahead, just like I did in 1989.
I'm going to ask you about the decisions made in Washington, D.C., because you mentioned some of the decisions in Moscow, obviously, and we're going to talk about China later on. Yeah. But 1989 was a moment that a new era opened, and that was arguably an era of American unipolarity, the most, by far, consequential actor in that period was the United States. So obviously what the United States was doing or not doing mattered greatly. So how would you rate 2 or 3 most important things in that period that were choice of America, not necessarily of this president or that president, but America as a political establishment that, in your opinion, contributed to the fact that we are now on a cusp of an era which, say, we don't know what brings?
Look, we like to talk about the post-Cold War era as the peak of American power and influence. And in a relative sense, that might be true. In an absolute sense, American power peaked in probably 1950, immediately after World War II. And it declined ever since, because as Europe rose in terms of power and influence, as other countries rose in power and influence globally, relative, the percentage of the global economy, the percentage of global strength of the United States, it went down. It's just because we didn't have that sharp comparator with the Soviet Union that we look at the post-Cold War era as an era of unquestioned American dominance. I think historically we're going to look back at the post-Cold era as a squandered opportunity. And it's not just Washington, it certainly is Washington, but it is Europe, it is candidly Russia, it is China, the rest of the world, that we could have done so much more with it, but we were fundamentally unserious, because in an era where there was no immediate threat of conflict, we had this historic peace dividend. And the question is going to be, what did we do with the peace dividend? Now, today, I'm struggling with this because I'm hesitant to focus just on the unipolar moment and put all blame or all credit on the United States when there's an environmental factor here. And the notion of a bipolar moment, I'm deeply resistant even to the phrasing in the last several weeks of a G2. It's not something I like. And I'm also equally skeptical of the notion of multipolarity. Right? All that implies to me is uncertainty and chaos, and it's a useful academic construct, right? But I don't know what it means, right? In terms of the world we're living right now. And so
you wouldn't use the multipolarity?
No, because they're really not really poles, right? And it depends on what issue you're talking about, right? And then you've also got these meta trends in terms of information technology and the rise of large multinational corporations and then large tech companies that are doing that, and then internal groupings. And so it depends on what are you talking about. You can talk about multipolarity just in terms of military strength, but even in that context, what groupings are you talking about? When you've got AUKUS, this historic security agreement between Australia, the United States and the UK, that's one thing that's clearly security, but you've also got the Quad, right? And so what does that mean in terms of multipolarity? I would describe it as much more as an uncertain, unsettled, and dynamic era. And the last thing I would mention on that point is, if I'm looking forward, both the United States, or all of the United States, Russia, and China have old leaders, relatively unhealthy leaders by all accounts, right? Who will not be there in a decade. So if you ask me to forecast, what do I think the next generation is going to look like, or the next decade is going to look like? Do I look at 5 years is going to look like? They have such a heavy impact on their national policies and their relative strength. Are they poles, right? Obviously India, you've got India under Modi, you've got Japan, they're not exactly chopped liver, they've got some real things. And so it depends on the issue, it depends how they play. So it really is an era of tremendous uncertainty and complexity.
Fascinating way of looking at it. I would like to, go to the area where you come from, where you work, where you're currently working, and that is in Australia, but as an expert, first and foremost on Indo-Pacific. So I'd like to ask you about the origin of the term, because in my research, I started coming up with this term increasingly often as of, say, 2006, 2007, and most famously, it was late Shinzo Abe's speech in the Indian Parliament, the confluence of two waters, of two oceans,
yeah.
Exactly. So he mentions Indo-Pacific then, and you start having these terms increasingly frequently. In 2018, there was a renaming of the American command from the Pacific Command into the Indo-Pacific Command. So what brings this term into such a prominence and significance as of, say, 2006 and 2007, whereas the geography has always been there?
So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. To understand the Indo-Pacific, you have to go back a little bit further and understand the Asia-Pacific. Because at the beginning of my professional career, almost 40 years ago, no one used the term Asia-Pacific either. We talked about Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia. Australia was part of Oceania writ large. And it really was in the late 1980s when two big developments happened, right? South Korea and Japan, the economic powerhouse of the day, wanted to invest and integrate southward in the opportunities that existed in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia itself was trying to become more central to the regional dynamic, and Australia and New Zealand, for their part, wanted to be part of Asia and to integrate north. And so it was an initiative by Australia, by Korea, by Japan to launch the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Initiative. And then you led to a proliferation of Asia-Pacific based organizations and groupings and meetings. And even the Asia-Pacific doesn't have a firm definition. Some organizations include the entire west coast of the Americas, north and south. Some do not. Some are more ASEAN-centric. Some are less centric. Some are more Northeast Asia-centric. There's a broad grouping of what Asia-Pacific is, right? But for the most part, even including APEC, they did not include India. They did not extend into the Indian Ocean. So if I'm honest, when I was sitting in Washington, D.C., and around that time, 2004, 2005, I heard people talking about Indo-Pacific. I mocked the construct. I didn't like it. I thought Indian Ocean plus Pacific Ocean, you got 2/3 of the globe, you might as well be global. It has no real explanatory power for policymakers. And so I opposed it. I was an Asia-Pacific fan. But they say where you stand depends on where you sit. I had moved to Australia 12 years ago now. And as you mentioned, I live in Perth, Australia's Indian Ocean capital, on the western coast of Australia, and kind of at the fulcrum point of the Indo-Pacific. So we look out at the Indian Ocean, but our prosperity and our trade is tied to sea lanes going up north into Northeast Asia. And so in that context, from an Australian perspective, Indo-Pacific makes sense. Australia as a country is an Indo-Pacific country. We have a Pacific coast and an Indian Ocean coast. Sure. And on a more specific level, Australia, where I sit in Western Australia, where we're the economic engine of the country, iron ore and gas and increasingly critical minerals and agricultural products, we've never been a Pacific country. Our engagement has always been north and west, right? Mm-hmm. So Indo-Pacific is for Australia a unified whole of nation foreign policy. Mm-hmm. So look, success has many fathers. The famed speech by Abe Shinzo actually never used the term Indo-Pacific. It just said, confluence of two great oceans, right? Yeah. And there are certain Indian admirals who used it before. But it was actually Australia that for the first time began to use the term Indo-Pacific in official government documents. The 2013 Defense White Paper, the 2016 Defense White Paper, the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper, the 2020 Defense Strategic Update. And again, those all both predated and contributed to the decision to rename the Pacific Command Indo-Pacific Command. And then it contributed to Japan's articulation of a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, an Indian Indo-Pacific strategy, ASEAN itself adopting an Indo-Pacific outlook, right? An ASEAN outlook for the Indo-Pacific. And so it has been an evolution, and there are two things that are at the core of that evolution. Number one, India in or India out. And it's really, really important, I think, from an Australian perspective, that we have India in. Because the Asia-Pacific architecture that existed before doesn't include India. So it's a more inclusive architecture. One that does, again, in a self-serving way, kind of put Australia in the middle. So if you look at the Japanese Indo-Pacific strategy or the Indian Indo-Pacific strategy, both of them have a major element recognizing the central role of Australia in that framing in terms of how the Indo-Pacific lies. Now, the second thing you need to understand is that it is inherently an inclusive context. It is an additive or an expansive construct. And it was originally opposed by China. The Chinese foreign minister back in 2018, I think it was, at the Shangri-La Dialogue said, the Indo-Pacific is just like so much sea foam, the winds will blow it away. And that hasn't happened, right? Most countries in our region and most countries globally and most organizations, including the European Union, have now adopted their own Indo-Pacific strategies out of recognition of the importance that we have an expansive additive version, that there's no magic line between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. The sea lanes of communications, the energy trade, the security issues are indivisible. They're not.
And why do you think that the Chinese do not seem to have bought into this concept? They're perhaps not as strongly opposed as they were back in 2018 at the Shangri-La Dialogue, but I can assure you that there is still a pushback, including when it came to the putting together of this issue. So why do you think that the Chinese are not seeing it that way?
They understandably have developed a bit of a victim mentality that is important to a lot of their foreign policy, that there is an encirclement strategy, a containment strategy, and so understandably, they view things like this in that light, right? And the fact that it was forcefully advocated by Abe Shinzo, the former prime minister, the late prime minister in Japan, who was quite conservative, made them more skeptical. The fact that it was adopted by the US Pacific Command made them more skeptical. It fits into their containment narrative. But I will say quite clearly, China is in the Indo-Pacific. So it's not exclusionary to China. It's not anti-China. You can't have an Indo-Pacific region or policy or strategy without China. And so in essence, what China is reacting to are some Indo-Pacific strategies, not the Indo-Pacific reality. Because the reality is, India is a growing and influential force in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. They've got an Indo-Pacific framed agreement with Indonesia. They've got an important and historical role in the South Pacific as well. And countries like Australia really welcome that. And I will frame it quite clearly. If you have a closed ecosystem like the Asia-Pacific, and even though the membership wasn't tightly defined, in that ecosystem, China has grown and grown and grown in influence and is challenging the rules of the road in that region. You've got two choices. You can contest it, fight against it, which no one really wants to do, especially the Southeast Asians. Or you can expand the pie, right? You can expand the region. And by bringing India and the Indian Ocean riparian countries into a region, inherently what you're doing is moving to what we were discussing earlier, without using the term, moving to a multipolar world. The Chinese love the idea of a G2. They want to be the big dogs, where we are a big country and you are small countries.
Pushing against the term. I mean, G2 was something that was opposed by the Chinese when Obama tried to use it, and quite recently also in the Xi-Trump. Trump was the guy who talked about the G2, but Xi did not seem to have embraced this.
We have a very different recollection of events. From my lived experience, the primary advocate to the G2 is China, not the United States. Deeply resisted by the Obama administration, in fact, rejected by the Obama administration. Because if you're the United States, a G2 what does that mean for Japan or Korea or Australia that are treaty allies of the United States? So the US doesn't buy into it. The US buys much more into what Americans would call the liberal international system, which Australians call the rules-based order, right? And China wanted to mano y mano, big dog versus big dog. And so there was, just 2 weeks ago, a lot of consternation among other US treaty allies when Donald Trump slipped into what was perceived to be a Chinese trap in using the term G2. G2 is broadly rejected by the community that I was part of for 25 years in Washington, D.C., because it feeds into the Chinese narrative that we solve these big problems between the two big countries, as opposed to the rules-based order. So in my mind, the Indo-Pacific, one of the things that's advantageous about it is that it is, again, more additive, it's more inclusive, and it has a greater role for countries like Australia or Japan or Korea or the Philippines, and then primarily for a country like India.
So let me pick on this rules-based order that you mentioned. I mean, for Indo-Pacific or in general, American liberal international order. I'm not sure if we can any longer talk about that particular terminology, especially using the word liberal with the current U.S. government. But leave that aside. Let's talk about a rules-based order. What is it for you, the rules-based order? What are the fundamental precepts or foundations, if you will, of the rules-based order?
So fundamentally, it is a repudiation of the old notion that might makes right, which is why I responded in that way to the notion of the G2. It's the old Thucydidean kind of construct of the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. We, in the post-war era, the post-World War II era, built an international system of treaties, organizations, laws, multilateralism, norms and standards. And so a country like Australia, while we have a large geographic landmass, we're only 25 million people. We don't want to live in a world where might makes right. We want to live in a world where the international system is the system of international law and standards and norms and treaties. That's the rules-based order. Now, the truth is, it's never been true or absolute in any way, shape, or form, right? The rules-based order was built on a foundation of American security guarantees, of American provided security. That allowed both on the economic front, the development of countries like Korea and Japan and Taiwan, or nations like Taiwan rather, and Southeast Asia. It enabled a lot of what we would consider to be the regional constructs or infrastructure around the region to be built. And so you rightly said one of the real challenges of this era is, does the rules-based order still exist without a guarantor? Is the United States' commitment to, not just here in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific as well, providing that security foundation is shaken, people are then questioning the overall construct. So you begin to wonder, is it real? Does it mean things? But whether it's real or not, if you're a country like Korea or Japan or the Philippines or most of the ASEAN nations, you don't want to live in a world where might makes right. It's the basic idea behind the United Nations. It's the basic idea behind multilateralism. And so it's not a surprise that Australia as a nation is a full-throated multilateralist. So my view, and again, I've only been an Australian citizen for 6 years. I've only lived in Australia for 12. You are hard-pressed to find a country anywhere in the globe that is more proactively engaged in multilateralism or the rules-based order than Australia. We love a meeting. We want to be part of it. Part of it is because for us, how do we guarantee our national sovereignty as a relatively small population? I jokingly tell people, you have to remember that there are 5 million more Texans on the planet than there are Australians, which means Australians have to work twice as hard to combat Texas's malign influence on the globe, right? But what that means is, how do we guarantee our security? Well, number one, we have a strong alliance relationship with a great power far away. Historically, the United Kingdom. Since World War II, the United States, right? But the other thing we rely upon, the other pillar of our strategy, has been the rules-based order. And that's not just economics and trade, that's also security, right? And so you might ask yourself the question, why is a country like Australia, which is a long ways away from North Korea, so vocal in criticizing the North Korean nuclear program? I would say after the US, Japan, and South Korea, probably not in that order, inverse order, there's been no country globally that has been more actively involved in the North Korean nuclear program than Australia. Well, why? I mean, we are now technically within range of North Korean missiles, but that's not why. The reason is because whether it's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or the Chemical Weapons Treaty or Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty or the whole range of other international efforts, anything that undermines that rules-based order is a direct threat to our own national security strategy. Now, as you've rightly identified, we're in a very difficult point here, and that is, as the United States has become more volatile, shall we say, particularly over the last decade, but this year in particular, Australia's got a challenge, right? Because we have a treaty alliance with the United States, which is absolutely essential, but at the same time, that treaty ally, the United States, is taking actions which are undermining the other pillar of our national strategy, which is the rules-based order. And so in that context, what we're finding, and one of the reasons I'm in Serbia, is that Australia is looking everywhere for like-minded partners. The European Union, the UK, Germany, Sweden, Canada, Mexico, Japan, Korea, everybody. Why? Because we all need to be working together to hold together whatever vestiges of the rules-based order we can, and then to reconstruct it hopefully in a better way once we pass this
let me push back a little bit on the rules-based order, because I travel extensively in the global south, and Serbia is in a way by political heritage of the non-aligned movement, and the fact that we're not in the European Union. Some even like to say that Serbia is the northmost country of the global south in a way. When you travel around the global south, there is a lot of resentment when it comes to the notion of the rules-based order. And let's not talk about the volatility of America of this year. Yeah. It's obviously difficult to square it with the rules-based order, especially when it comes to trade, for instance. But, take Iraq, for instance. That was at the very height, if you will, of American might, and America's being the underwriter of as you say, the rules-based order. And that was the intervention in Iraq in absence of the Security Council decision to do that, despite attempts at passing a resolution at the Security Council. So is Iraq, for instance, a violation of the rules-based order in the same way that you would probably call the invasion of Ukraine in 2022?
I wouldn't draw direct equivalence between the two, but I would agree that it would be a violation. I mean, people in the foreign policy community, I think almost universally, consider the U.S. involvement in the Iraq War, not the first Gulf War, but the second one, to be one of the most monumental mistakes of our era. And going back to your earlier question, one of the things that hastened the collapse of the rules-based order. It undermined U.S. influence and reputation, and it wasted, blood and treasure that could have been spent on strengthening U.S. democratic systems and infrastructure and a bunch of other stuff. And so, yes, no question that I would consider the Iraq War a violation of the rules-based order. Again, I won't give moral equivalence, right? Because, there's at no point where the United States said, Iraq does not have a right to exist, that we are going to assume it and take it over as a colony, right? And we've got a situation in Ukraine right now where the fundamental rationale behind that is the elimination of Ukraine as an independent state. So it's a fundamental violation of statehood as opposed to an action which is debatable one way or the other. But there is no question in my mind. There are a lot of cases that you could point to historically, Vietnam, a number of others where the United States took actions, as the unipower or unipolar kind of power in the world that was able to do that, where there were mistakes, there were good things and bad things, and as a net whole, I'm finding right now, I just was thinking over the weekend about what's happening in Sudan, and I don't know very much about Africa at all, but it's just remarkable to me how horrific some things are happening in the world, and there's no one at home, right? And if you look at the broad sweep of history, and we look at the last 70 years, yes, there were problems, yes, there were mistakes, but historically, it is one of the most stable, peaceful eras in human history, right? And so, is the rules-based order fake? Probably not, no. I think we're gonna miss it now that it's gone, right? We're gonna look back at the last 35 years for all the mistakes of the rules-based order with regret. And the thing that I find most troubling is that the primary victim of the end of that era is going to be those countries in the global south, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, is it good for them to have that broken? So for all the problems, I would have rather seen the community address the problems and improve them and build and strengthen it. And that's why I was highlighting the need for countries like Serbia and Australia, although we may not be big global powers, to have a role with like-minded partners in reconstructing an order that is more equal and more beneficial for all. Because I don't think that a world where there's chaos is good, because if you're in a world where might makes right, that's not helpful. Right?
Well, there is, speaking about chaos, especially economically, the volatility of the U.S. Has arguably been a significant contributor to this, with the range of unilateral tariffs being applied to allies and non-allies, basically around the world. If I'm not mistaken, the U.S. applied 10% tariffs to Australia, with some certain things being in a higher bracket, like automotive industry 25, or steel and aluminium being at 50. The Australian government called it unjustified and unfair, but did not retaliate, right? And when it comes to trade, in particular, you do a lot of trade with America. You do a lot of trade with Japan as well. But your combined trade with US and Japan is, if I'm not mistaken, still smaller than the trade that you do with China. So who do you see right now as a more volatile or less volatile partner, China or the United States?
Again, you're going to have to get in the nuance on that. what's happened with the US this year has been deeply disturbing to Australia. Australia is a trading nation who has invested heavily in not just the idea of free trade, but the reality of free trade. So we have largely over 30 years unilaterally disarmed, right? We don't believe in tariffs and trade barriers. And so even in our agriculture sector, which is sensitive for most countries around the world, we're self-confident enough in our ability to produce and export that we're an exporting nation, and we have built our prosperity historically on trade. So we want trade. In that context, what Donald Trump has done in particular, the Trump administration has done in particular, is deeply disruptive, whether it's the World Trade Organization itself or the capricious individual tariffs and how it's upset it. Now, you're correct. The impact on Australia was relatively minor, particularly compared to the rest of the world. The EU, countries next door like Canada, where there are personal, vengeful things going on there. India, where, again, there was personalized reasons there. But also in really important partners of the United States who are also treaty allies, like Japan and Korea, where 35%, 25% tariffs on automobiles, et cetera, really impact their economy. The economic impact on Australia of the tariffs has not been great. So we were already at the lowest level. We didn't have any desire to attract what I would call the eye of Sauron, right? We wanted to emphasize the fact that we have a trade deficit with the United States, whereas we have a massive trade surplus with China rather, in terms of that process, right? In that relationship. So in the end, I would say that in the year 2025, Australia has probably handled the relationship with the Trump administration better than any other country. And part of that is just we're very fortunate. The impacts of the tariffs on us has been relatively minor. We had a trade deficit to begin with. The United States needs our critical minerals. And so those were kind of a very important area of cooperation between us. And also as a treaty ally, AUKUS is an important thing. So that meeting went relatively well. Now, do the average Australian citizen or policymakers like the Trump administration instability and tariffs? Absolutely not. It's a violation of kind of our core strategy and is deeply disruptive to the global economy in every way. China's different in a different way. Yes, they're more predictable, but we underwent for the last probably 7 years a period of very overt Chinese economic coercion over the last 5 years, I would say rather, where they a number of reasons are concerned about Chinese influence in our democracy, influence in our education sector, influence in our media, the nature of some levels of Chinese investment, and then in particular, during the COVID era, the lack of transparency about Chinese culpability for the COVID pandemic, right, had led to some statements from Australia that led China to use a Chinese proverb, attempt to kill a chicken to scare the monkeys, right? To make an example of Australia. So in 2020, 2021, we were on the receiving end of some very overt economic coercion from China. Some massive bans, which were not compliant with China's treaty obligations or the World Trade Organization and our bilateral free trade agreement with China as well, on everything from barley to crayfish to wine to beef to coal. And it had a real impact on our economy. The Chinese thought that we would cave, and they issued, or rather leaked from their embassy in Canberra, a list of 14-point demands of things that we had to do if we wanted to get back in the good graces of China, none of which Australia has done. Mercifully, we've had a change in government. Everybody thinks that the current government in Australia right now, the Labor government, has had a thaw in the relationship with China, and I think that's the wrong temperature analogy. I would say what's happened is we've actually decreased the temperature. We're, as a government, not poking China in the eye anymore. We're being careful on that front. We haven't given way to any of their demands, right? And so we've just basically lowered the temperature. The relationship is somewhat stabilized, but public opinion in Australia matches public opinion in Japan or Korea or the Philippines, other countries that have been on the receiving end of Chinese economic coercion. So China is our largest trade partner. It's the largest trade partner of most countries around the world. It's arguably our most important trade partner. It is not our most important economic partner. That's actually the United States. Trade is transactional. It's just selling goods, right? And our trade with China is largely at the border, right? We sell commodities, iron ore, gas, other basic commodities. Whereas if you look at investment, we did a study probably about 5 years ago, and if you look at the amount of sales by U.S. majority-owned companies in Australia, they're 5 times the amount of U.S. trade with Australia, exports to Australia. And similarly, if you look at sales by U.S. majority-owned companies in the U.S., they're 4 times larger than Australian exports. So if you put it that way, economically, the investment itself and the ancillary economic impact investment, it means the U.S. is really much more important. It's just not as easily understood by the average person who just looks at selling rocks. And so in that context, yeah, both are their thing, and Australia as a trading nation, really needs to rely on not just China and the U.S., but also Japan and Korea and the EU and all the countries in the world, because we want stability and we want a rules-based order when it comes to trade.
So, do you consider China to be a security threat to Australia?
I would not consider China to be a direct security threat to Australia. I would consider China to be a security threat to Australian interests in the region, in the Indo-Pacific more broadly, and globally. And again, it's not just that we think that China is going to attack Australia, but that China has an interest in undermining the norms in the South China Seas of a very important country like the Philippines. That Chinese, in the last week, the level of the rhetoric in China against Japan has been stark, right? And it is because the Chinese have removed. They like the idea of ambiguity of the rest of the world about Taiwan, but they've now removed any ambiguity about Japan, saying if Japan has anything to do in any Taiwan contingency, we will attack Japan. Well, those are pretty stark things, and that's not something that Australia welcomes. It's not a useful thing, because Japan is a very important investor, a very important trade company, a partner in the region. I would say the same about South Korea, that was on the receiving end of Chinese economic coercion, and there's now disputes between the South Koreans and the Chinese in the Yellow Seas. And the same would be true with Vietnam. So, I think China, as it has grown, has been challenging the rules-based order in a way that is not good for the Chinese people or Chinese interests, but is designed to make the world safe for the Communist Party of China. And I think it's been net destabilizing. And if you look at Chinese military expenditures and Chinese capabilities and Chinese missiles and Chinese cyber activities and what China is doing in this region, in their support for Russia and Ukraine, and what China has been doing increasingly in a change of policy on North Korea and a whole other range of issues, I worry that China is taking positions that are not in Australia's interest.
I understand where you come from, but if you try to be like a neutral observer from afar, and I have this, luxury, being from the Balkans, which is very, very far away from that particular part of the world. There are about 120 U.S. bases, military bases in the world, and about 40 of them are in Asia, or in Asia-Pacific. China has a single one, which is in Africa. It's in Djibouti, and none, or at least none, that are, front and loaded like the American bases in Asia. So how come this understanding of the security threat to not Australia but Australian interest, how that squares with the fact that China's capacity to project force is definitely much smaller still, despite all these investments that you mentioned, like order of magnitude or even more smaller than America's, which very much stays part of the theater.
So part of the Chinese self-image, and I would also generously agree self-understanding, is that China is a peaceful country that doesn't interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries. And so their rise is benign and shouldn't be of concern to anyone. That's their self-image, that's their narrative, and probably understood that way here in the Balkans. if you really want to understand that question that you've asked about American presence in the region, you have to understand that the American presence in the region is not in any way, shape, or form coerced. When countries have asked Americans to leave, Vietnam, the Philippines, increasingly in South Korea, different periods of time, the Americans have left, right? So if you look at America's presence in Japan, in Korea, in the Philippines, increasingly in Southeast Asia, even in Australia, all these countries in the region want the Americans there. So the broader question is why? Why is Japan concerned about China? Why is Korea concerned about China? Why is Mongolia concerned about China? Why is Taiwan, obviously not recognized as a country, but as a people, concerned about China? Why is Vietnam concerned about China? Why is the Philippines? Why is Southeast Asia? Why is India? Now, if you're in China and you have been taught that your history is benign and you're only good, then you might say, oh, this must be because the evil Americans have been conspiring to make everybody hate us and to contain us in entrapment. If you understand any real history in the region, you understand that there's a long history of all countries on the periphery of China, that have had long experience with China. And so they are concerned about the rise of China. So Japan is concerned. Korea is concerned. I remember a trip to Vietnam years ago, where this was back in 2010, where out of 30 meetings we had with senior officials, unbidden, every single meeting went to their concern about China. And if you want the region why, it's because China occupied Vietnam for the better part of 1,000 years. And so the Vietnamese have a historic understanding of China that is different than the Chinese self-image. Most Chinese don't even know that China invaded Vietnam in 1979, right? That's not part of the Chinese education system, right? And so obviously Japan is most concerned. Korea is next door and very concerned. The Philippines are every single day facing overt pressure from a much more powerful, increasingly wealthy and capable power. And so part of this is during periods of Chinese weakness, China was unable to project power. But the stronger they get, the more capable they get, they are then projecting power, which on the one hand, as you say, is natural. The US has done it too. But again, if you're a riparian country, this is exactly why I'm going back to what I said earlier. This should not be a world viewed versus what the US has done versus what China can do, because that ignores the agency of countries like that. And so I'm living in Australia right now, and I'm an Australian citizen. Australia itself sees advantages in having a close alliance relationship with the United States and strengthening its capabilities, in response to growing Chinese projection capabilities.
But a lot of countries, especially in the ASEAN, when they are representatives of these countries, be they from the academic community or the diplomatic community, when you ask them, and ASEAN is this place which is, I think, for a very good reason, boasting about peace and stability and their ability to work together despite differences to enhance trade and cooperation and so on and so forth, and they're right at the heart of that geography. When you ask them what worries them most, they would say the growing U.S.-China rivalry. Yeah. They wouldn't call U.S. a threat. They wouldn't call, at least not directly, China a threat, but they would say, well, we're worried about U.S.-China rivalry, and if it goes out of hand, then things are going to become very difficult for us. It will be very difficult for us to, choose sides if we are forced to choose sides, and so on and so forth. So you talked about AUKUS, which is essentially a Western security minilateral organization, Australia, UK, and the United States, all parts of the political West, if you will. So do you think that creation of minilateral organizations, like AUKUS, for instance, are perhaps not intentionally, but de facto contributing to this, escalation of rivalry that so many countries in the region are worried about?
There is always going to be a question of sequencing, and who started when what, right? And so the Chinese narrative on this will be very different than the narrative that I might have, and so I understand that. There is no question in my mind that the Quad, close cooperation between the US and Australia and Japan and India, is a response to growing Chinese power and influence. But it is not the cause of growing Chinese power and influence. It is reactive to that, right? That's my view, right? Similarly, I think AUKUS is a response to, one, diminishing US capability, right? And the very real security needs in the region of Australia. I mean, we again have a massive country, same size as the continent of the United States, but again, with a population of 27 million people, and despite our very capable armed forces, a lot of territory to protect with a very limited ability, and so to have advanced capabilities is something that we need in an uncertain era in terms of that process, right? But that, again, I think is something that we weren't talking about 10 years ago because there was no perceived threat 10 years ago, right? And as the perception of the threat goes up, the need for capabilities goes up. The same would be true of what is called the Southeast Asian Quad, right? So cooperation between Australia and Japan and the United States and the Philippines in that region more broadly. The ADMM+3 kind of meetings more broadly in terms of the ASEAN Regional Forum. There's lots of different things. Obviously, there's going to be a fine balance to those where you want to include China in and you want to have kind of a regional standard and norm that is on security and other things, and others where you're reactive to it. I should be really clear. Historically, I think we look at this in the prism of today's world, and as you rightly said, most people presume that the problem is US-China rivalry, right? Over the last 100 years, there is no country in the world that has been more pro-China than the United States. If you look at the historical era of development, if you look at the World War II alliances during that period of time, and then even after the brief interregnum between the end of World War II when we recognized Taiwan, we still consider ourselves pro-China. When the gradual acceptance of the PRC, that period of economic development, I would say two things which I don't think are controversial. No country on the planet has benefited more from the rules-based order than China. And candidly, no country has contributed more to the development of China than the United States, both in terms of investment and output, kind of offtake for their exports. Well, so then this is my view. I don't think myself personally, or most countries in the world, are opposed to the rise of China. We all need the rise of China. We need to benefit from China. But China has changed direction. As they grew more and more powerful, they became increasingly anxious about their own fragility, their own demography, their own economic stability internally. And candidly, as they began to push up against others in the region, right, they wanted to project their power more. And so you ended up, candidly, you got to the point where they too early abandoned the admonition of Deng Xiaoping to hide and bide your strength, right? Just to be, and they got to the point where they figured, all right, we're a big dog and we're going to act like a big dog. But they acted like an 18th century or 19th century big dog, right? They wanted to do the things that European powers and the United States and others did in the 19th century, right? And so we began to see investments and activities and challenges. And again, I'm not talking about an American perspective or an Australian perspective. Again, and this is what I would urge this region. If you're sitting here in the Balkans, don't talk to an American about their perceived. Talk to a Japanese, a Korean, a Filipino, a Vietnamese, a Mongolian, an Indian. Talk to them about how they perceive China. And even as you rightly pointed out, there is a great debate within ASEAN. There's some stark differences within ASEAN. Singapore has some individuals who have very strong opinions, and your friends of yours and mine as well. But as a government, they're pretty pragmatic, right? And that Vietnam has a party that has close party-to-party relationships, but as a country and as a people, they have a long, long history with China, right? They have a long history with China. And then obviously the Philippines with the treaty alliance and being directly threatened in territorial issues. Indonesia is kind of a swing state. Malaysia is kind of a swing state. Laos and Cambodia, candidly, deep party-to-party relationships means that Chinese influence there has now engendered broad public opposition, right? So it's a pretty complex world.
And how about in this way of describing countries being swing states and neither here nor there, how about India? India is giant, right? The world's most populous nation, part of Quad, but also part of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is perhaps from the outside, sometimes confusing the experts. With this latest spat with the United States, which caused a lot of locomotion this year, seems to be coming to like a truce these days, right? But this slapping of the tariffs and difficult comments, as well as considerations of the India-Pakistan friction in a way that makes things in Delhi quite complicated. Do you think that the current trajectory of India, under the geopolitical circumstances that we have, is actually moving away into the swing camp, as you...
Well, again, along with the former Yugoslavia, and I put Serbia in that camp, India obviously was a global leader in the global non-aligned movement for a long period of time. So they historically have been the most swing of swing states. Over the last 25 years, I think one of the most important geostrategic shifts globally has been India's increasing recognition that their future lie with closer relations, not just with the United States, but with Europe and countries like Australia and Japan, etc., that they were no longer just going to be tantamount to a swing state there stuck between the two, that they wanted to have their own agency in going forward. Almost everything in the Trump era, particularly this year, has at its core some grain of truth, whether it's immigration policy or concerns about trade policy or whatever it might be. The one that is so bizarre and so inexplicably damaging has been the spat with President Trump personally in India. There is no constituency in Washington, D.C., on the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, in the Congress and the business community, that thinks it's a good idea for the U.S. to have a tariff fight with India right now. This is really, classic Mad King behavior. Donald Trump, wanting to claim credit for solving a conflict between India and Pakistan and expecting India to kiss his ring and thank him for that and give him full credit for that and nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize without understanding at all Indian history and the unique sensitivities of Indian history about that process. And so this is a disastrous and unfortunate development. And you're right, in recent days, the system is doing everything they can to mitigate that damage because it makes no sense. Because long term, India feels a civilizational contest with China. They've got a long border with China. There are real border disputes with China. Until this month, India has canceled all direct flights to China. 1.3 billion people, 1.4 billion people, it's the other way around actually. There are no direct flights.
Direct flights, yeah.
That just tells you that India has begun to recognize that they are in a bit of a competition themselves. And they don't want to choose sides. Of course, you're right. They're going to do both, and they're going to pursue an Indian way to do that. And they still need to rely on Russia for spare parts for their military. But the future, they had largely thought was in this direction. I don't know exactly what it means in this Cold War, because to go back to the start of our conversation, I don't know where we're going.
But my last question is going to be about climate change and sustainability. And I know that Australia has ambitious green/sustainability goals, and that for a lot of countries in your area, especially the small Pacific Island states, this is an issue of life or death. And China, again, is a big champion of fighting climate change and a leader in technologies related to sustainability, be that electric vehicles or solar or wind and so on and so forth. Now with America's kind of moving away from this being a priority, and you can not only look at the U.S. government statements, but the way that the money flows, in the American financial system. And China strengthening its centrality when it comes to the future of sustainability. How do you see Australia's positioning itself in this context?
Australia, as a body politic, as a population, is quite educated, quite erudite, quite progressive. Probably more akin to kind of the average European. And so there is broad majority support in Australia for addressing climate change in the best way we possibly know how. So net zero obligations and commitments and transitions. At the same time, we are torn between our very important international partners. You pointed out the South Pacific. We have a very important role with what we call our Pacific family, these small island states for whom climate change is not academic. It is existential. And so Australia already is providing essential humanitarian and development aid to these countries, and then very importantly, scenarios for which they can come to Australia. That's why we use the term Pacific family. They're part of our family in the region, and we are going to have some responsibility as a nation in that region to mitigate the disaster of climate change. And they expect us to take a leadership role. So in our diplomacy, we receive a lot of pressure from our European friends, but also from our Pacific Island friends. At the same time, we've got other really important both security and economic partners like Japan and Korea who rely upon us to be a reliable supplier of energy security. So Australia is the third largest producer of gas in the world, after Qatar and the United States right now. And Japan and Korea want reliability of supply, and it's something you and Serbia will understand. Sure. They want reliably diversified supply because they don't want to rely upon Russia, and they don't want to rely upon the Middle East with the instability in supply chains. And so we've got, on a diplomatic level, pressures, and internally we've got societal pressures between some of our cities, which are very, very progressive on these issues, and want us to never, ever again, to have another gas project ever, to our economic engine that gets tremendous benefit from selling that to our partners. And so there are real tensions that Australia is facing on a daily basis when it comes to these issues. And it's ones that I think that you could probably understand quite well here in Serbia.
Professor Gordon Flake, thank you very much for this great conversation.
It's my great honor and delighted to be here in Belgrade.
Thank you.